The sun hung heavy above the valley of Elah, casting long shadows upon the hills that separated two great armies. On one side stood the Philistines, their ranks filled with hardened warriors whose shields gleamed like burnished brass. On the other side were the children of Israel, trembling though they bore the name of the living God. Between them lay a valley that had become a stage, not for armies clashing, but for one man's voice echoing across the rocks. That voice belonged to Goliath of Gath. Goliath was no ordinary soldier. He stood 6 cubits and a span tall, his towering frame covered in armor of bronze that weighed more than what most men could lift. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and its iron head alone weighed 600 shekels. Morning after morning, evening after evening, he descended into the valley, his footsteps thunderous, his laughter cruel. He shouted defiance against Israel and against their God, challenging any man to face him in single combat. Yet, day after day, no one dared step forward. Fear was their constant companion. Even King Saul, who had once stood taller than any in Israel, shrank back in silence. The warriors who had fought countless battles felt their courage melt away whenever the Philistine shadow stretched across the valley floor. 40 days passed, and still the challenge rang unanswered. The valley, once filled with the clash of swords and the cries of armies, had become a place of dread, where one man's arrogance silenced a nation. But as the Philistines' voice boomed, the stage was being prepared for someone the armies had not considered. Not a mighty warrior, nor a seasoned general. A shepherd boy, unknown to the world, would one day step onto this same field and change its story forever. Far away from the valley where warriors quaked and giants boasted, the hills of Bethlehem were quiet, brushed with the soft winds of pasture land. It was here that a boy named David, the youngest son of Jesse, kept his father's sheep. To his older brothers, he was nothing more than the smallest in the family, a messenger boy, good enough for errands but unfit for war. Yet, in the quiet places of Bethlehem, David was learning lessons no battlefield could teach. David's days were filled with the bleating of sheep and the songs of his harp. He was a shepherd, yes, but also a poet whose heart burned with love for the Lord. While others saw solitude, David saw a sanctuary. Along beneath the stars, he learned to pray. With nothing but his sling and his staff, he learned to fight. When lions prowled the hills or bears came roaring to steal a lamb, David did not run. He struck them down with the strength that came not from himself, but from the God of Israel. What his brothers dismissed as child play was in truth the training ground of a warrior after God's own heart. Jesse, David's father, was a man respected among his people. He had 8 sons, and the eldest 3, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were already serving in Saul's army. They wore armor and carried swords, their names listed among the men of war. David, however, was left behind, tending sheep and running small tasks for the household. But the eyes of heaven do not measure greatness the way men do. While Israel trembled in the valley of Elah, God was watching the hills of Bethlehem, where a boy strummed his harp and whispered prayers no one else could hear. One morning, Jesse called for David. His older sons were with Saul at the battlefront, and as a father, he longed to hear news of them. He gathered provisions, parched grain, loaves of bread, and cheeses, and placed them into David's hands. "Take these to your brothers," Jesse instructed, "and bring me word of how they fare." To Jesse, it was a simple errand. To David, it was obedience to his father. To God, it was the beginning of a divine appointment. So David left his sheep in the care of a keeper and set out early in the morning, carrying food and hope into a valley he had never seen. The shepherd boy, unnoticed by the world, was walking straight into the history of his people. His sharp songs had prepared his heart. His sling had trained his hands. Every step on that dusty road to Elah was a step closer to destiny. The armies of Israel did not know that their deliverer was coming, not in the form of a mighty warrior, nor a seasoned general. A shepherd's boy, unknown to the world, would one day step onto this same field and change its story forever. Morning mist lingered over the valley of Elah, as the sun rose and the armies assembled again in their positions. The Israelites formed their lines on one hill, and the Philistines faced them from the opposite ridge. Between them stretched the valley floor, empty save for the dust and the tension of war. But no swords clashed, no trumpet sounded. Instead, one figure broke the silence, as he had done every morning for 40 days. Goliath of Gath stepped forward. His colossal frame cast a shadow long enough to remind Israel of their own smallness. His bronze helmet gleamed in the light, and his coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels. Yet he wore it with ease, as if it were a child garment. His spear shaft, thick and heavy as a weaver's beam, rested easily in his hand. The iron head of that spear alone outweighed the swords of ordinary men. A shield-bearer walked before him, though even without one, Goliath was fortress enough. With a voice that shook the valley, he thundered, "Why you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us." Each word was a spear hurled into the hearts of Israel. His mockery was not just against Saul or the soldiers, it was against the God of Israel himself. "I defy the armies of Israel this day," he cried, his laughter echoing across the hills. "Give me a man, that we may fight together." The Israelites, from the youngest soldier to King Saul himself, trembled. Not a man dared move forward. Day after day, morning and evening, Goliath repeated the challenge, and each time fear deepened its grip. The men began to whisper among themselves that no one in Israel could match such power. Even Saul, the tallest in the land, who had once inspired courage, now hid in his tent, silent and shaken. 40 days is a long time to listen to mockery. It is long enough for fear to take root, to grow into despair. Israel's army, meant to be a light among the nations, stood paralyzed. Their faith in the Lord was smothered by the sight of a man whose stature loomed larger than their courage. But what they did not see was that God had already chosen his champion, not from among the warriors standing in armor, but from the fields where a boy kept sheep and sang psalms beneath the stars. The challenge of Goliath was not only to Israel's strength, it was to their faith. Would they believe in the God who had parted seas and brought down walls, or would they bow to fear at the sight of one man's height and armor? The valley had become a mirror, reflecting their doubts back to them. But soon, another voice would rise, not with boasts, not with threats, but with confidence rooted in the Lord of hosts. And when that voice came, it would not tremble.
The road to Eli wound through the hills, and as he walked, David could hear the distant murmur of armies, the clang of armor, the bray of horns, and the rumble of thousands of feet marching into their ranks. It was a sound unlike the quiet fields of Bethlehem. But the boy's heart was steady. For years, he had fought battles unseen by men, against lions, against bears, against the loneliness of the wilderness. Each time, God had proved faithful. And so, step after step, he carried not just bread, but a confidence no army could give him. When David arrived at the camp, he saw Israel's soldiers arrayed against the Philistines. Dust rose as men shouted and clashed shields, trying to summon courage for battle. He hurried to the supply keeper, left the provisions, and then ran to greet his brothers at the front line. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah stood armored, their eyes fixed on the valley. But even as David greeted them, a voice shattered the air. Goliath had stepped forward again. His booming challenge thundered across the valley. "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." The mockery stung David's ears. He looked around, expecting someone to step forward. But instead, the men of Israel fled back in terror. Warriors twice David's size trembled like children. The boy's eyes widened, not at the giant, but at the fear. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" His words, simple yet piercing, startled those nearby. They spoke of Saul's promise, riches, freedom from taxes, and even the king's daughter in marriage to whoever killed the giant. Yet none dared attempt it. To David, it was not about reward. It was about the honor of God's name, which was being dragged through the dust of that valley. But his words did not sit well with Eliab, his eldest brother. Anger flared in Eliab's heart. "Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride, and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle." David turned to him, calm but resolute. "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" The question lingered in the air, like a spark waiting to catch fire. Around him, soldiers whispered of his boldness. The news reached Saul's tent, and soon David was summoned before the king himself. A shepherd boy had walked into a battlefield ruled by fear. He carried no sword, no armor, no reputation, yet already his words had pierced the silence. Where men had seen only a giant, David saw a cause worth fighting for. The valley that echoed with Goliath's roar was about to hear a new sound, the voice of faith, spoken by the lips of a boy. The tent of King Saul was heavy with the smell of fear. Messengers came and went with reports of Goliath's latest challenge, yet none brought news of a willing warrior. The king sat troubled, his crown a burden heavier than his armor. When word reached him of a boy in the camp who spoke boldly, Saul demanded to see him. And so David, son of Jesse, entered the tent where soldiers quailed. At first glance, Saul's eyes betrayed surprise. This was no seasoned fighter, no towering champion. A shepherd's youth stood before him, his face yet fresh with boyhood, his hands calloused, not from swords, but from staff and sling. Saul's voice trembled with disbelief. "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." Yet David's eyes did not falter. With quiet strength he replied, "Thy servant kept thy father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by the beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." The tent grew still. David's voice carried not arrogance, but certainty. He spoke of the past as a witness of God's faithfulness, and of the future as a canvas awaiting God's hand. Then he declared, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." Faith, when genuine, unsettles doubt. Saul looked at the boy, and though reason screamed against the idea, something in David's confidence pierced the gloom. At last, Saul said, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." Even so, doubt lingered among the soldiers who overheard. To them, David's words sounded reckless, his faith naive. They had measured Goliath's height, the weight of his armor, the strength of his spear. They had counted the cost of failure, but forgotten the God who parted seas and toppled walls. David, however, measured differently. He saw not the size of the giant, but the greatness of the Lord. This was the dividing line. The men of Israel believed only in what their eyes could see. David believed in what his heart knew of God. In that moment, the valley was no longer about Goliath versus Israel. It was about faith versus fear. A boy had stood before a king, and where warriors had shrunk back, he declared victory before the battle began. When Saul gave his consent, the tent stirred with cautious hope. Perhaps this boy could do what none of them dared. But doubt still gnawed at the king's mind, and he sought to strengthen David with the weapons of men. "If you go," Saul reasoned, "then at least you must be armed like a soldier." Servants brought the king's own armor, bronze helmet, coat of mail, and sword. Piece by piece they placed them upon David. The helmet slid low over his brow, the coat of mail hung heavy upon his small frame, and the sword felt alien in his hand. Those around looked on, perhaps reassured that the boy was now clothed like a warrior. Yet David's steps faltered under the weight. He moved a few paces, testing the armor, but each movement was stiff, foreign, unnatural. At last David shook his head. With quiet resolve he said, "I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them." And with that he removed the armor, piece by piece, until he stood again as he had come, a shepherd boy, clothed not in bronze but in faith. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. To them it looked like folly, walking into the valley unarmored, unarmed, and untrained. But David knew something they did not. Victories are not won by iron and bronze, but by the hand of the living God. David stepped out of Saul's tent, carrying only what he trusted, his shepherd's staff, his sling of leather, and a pouch ready for stones. He walked toward the brook that cut through the valley floor, the shouts of Goliath echoing faintly in the distance. Kneeling by the water, he searched the stream bed until he found them, 5 smooth stones, rounded by years of running water, small enough to fit in his palm, but strong enough to fly true. He placed them in his pouch, each one a reminder that God does not need much to bring down the mighty. As he rose, his mind wandered back to the hills of Bethlehem. He remembered the lambs huddled in fear as lions roared. He remembered the nights when only the stars bore witness to his battles. Time and again, it was not his strength that prevailed, but God's. This moment was no different. Goliath was merely another predator threatening the flock of Israel, and David was still a shepherd under orders of a greater shepherd. From the ridges, soldiers watched as David descended into the valley. No shield-bearer marched before him. No sword gleamed at his side. Only his sling swung at his belt, and in his eyes burned a confidence that unsettled even the hardened. The Philistines jeered at the sight, mocking Israel for sending a boy. The Israelites whispered in shame, wondering if they had delivered their nation into the giants' hands. But David was unmoved, for he knew the battle did not belong to men, nor to giants, but to the Lord of hosts. Better to stand with God in a sling than to stand without him in all the armor of the world. The valley of Elah grew still as David stepped forward, the sun glinting off the giant who awaited him. On one side, the Philistine army broke into laughter at the sight of a boy walking without armor. On the other side, the soldiers of Israel stood silent, their hopes hanging by the thinnest thread. Between them, the ground trembled under the footsteps of Goliath as he strode into the open field. The giant's shadow stretched long across the dust. His bronze armor flashed like fire. His spear glinted like a deadly star. When his eyes fell upon David, he sneered, "Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves?" His laughter rolled like thunder, and he cursed David by his gods. "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field." The Philistines roared their approval, beating their shields in rhythm to their champions' taunts. The Israelites held their breath, waiting for David to falter, waiting for fear to break his stride. Yet the boy did not retreat. His sling hung ready in his hand, and his eyes fixed not on the giant's weapons, but on the God he served. David's voice rose clear and unwavering, carrying across the valley. "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee.
and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." His word struck like lightning. The soldiers of Israel stirred as though something long buried was awakening. The Philistines scoffed, yet unease rippled among them. For the boy's voice carried no tremor. It carried certainty, the kind that no armor could shield against. Then the silence shattered. Goliath began to move, his massive frame striding forward, his spear poised to strike. The ground seemed to quake beneath his steps, each one a drumbeat of doom. But David did not wait. He ran swiftly toward the battle line. His hand diving into his pouch, he drew forth a stone, smooth and small, and set it into the sling. The valley froze in that instant. Two figures, unequal in every earthly measure, advanced toward one another. On one side, a champion of flesh, built in might, armored in bronze, confident in self. On the other, a shepherd boy, armed with faith, swift of foot, and fearless in heart. History itself held its breath as the showdown began.
The air in the valley of Elah thickened with tension as David's sling began to whirl. The leather strap cut the silence, spinning faster and faster, each turn a heartbeat of destiny. Across from him, Goliath bore down with the force of a storm, his armor clanging, his spear raised to strike. The soldiers of both camps leaned forward, breaths caught, eyes wide. Time itself seemed to pause between the world of the sling and the roar of the giant. Then it came. The sling snapped forward, and the stone flew, guided not merely by David's skill, but by the unseen hand of the Lord. It whistled through the air with deadly precision. It struck the Philistine in the center of his forehead, his one place of weakness, unguarded by armor. The sound of impact echoed like a hammer on an anvil. The stone sank deep, and the mighty Goliath stumbled. His roar faltered, his eyes rolled, and with a crash like thunder, he fell face first into the dust of the valley. For a moment, silence blanketed the field. The Philistines froze, disbelief etched on their faces. The Israelites stood motionless, hardly daring to believe what their eyes had seen. One stone, one shepherd, one moment, and the terror of 40 days lay defeated in the dirt. The ground that had trembled under Goliath's steps now bore his lifeless weight. David did not hesitate. He ran swiftly to the fallen giant, leapt upon his body, and drew Goliath's massive sword from its sheath. The weapon, too heavy for most men, felt light in his hands because the Lord was with him. With one swift stroke, he severed the giant's head, lifting it high for all to see. The valley erupted, shouts of triumph from Israel, gasps of horror from the Philistines. The taunt that had silenced Israel for weeks was answered in a single blow of faith. What men had called impossible, God had made reality. David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, had slain the champion of Gath without sword, without armor, without human power. He had proven that the battle belongs not to giants nor kings, but to the Lord of hosts. The victory was not in the stone, it was in the God who guided it. In that moment, the valley of fear became the valley of triumph. And the boy who once carried bread and cheese to his brothers now carried the head of a giant as proof of God's deliverance. His hands bore not the weight of pride, but of testimony, evidence that when faith stands against fear, heaven itself fights for the faithful. Israel's trembling was turned into shouts of joy. The soldiers who had once cowered now surged forward with renewed courage. On the opposite ridge, panic spread like fire among the Philistines. Their champion was gone, their pride shattered, their strength broken. The valley that had once echoed with Goliath's boasts now resounded with the name of the Lord. And David, still breathless from the battle, stood as living proof that God can use the smallest vessel to bring down the greatest stronghold. The valley of Elah trembled not with Goliath's footsteps now, but with the thunder of victory. David stood tall, the giant's severed head in his grasp, his youthful face fierce with the fire of triumph. For 40 days the Philistine had mocked and taunted. For 40 nights he had silenced the songs of Israel. But with one stone, the roar of arrogance was silenced forever. Across the ridge, the Philistines faltered. Their champion, the one they trusted as their fortress of flesh, lay dead. Their hearts melted like wax, and confusion rippled through their ranks. Shouts of fear arose among them. What had begun as laughter at the sight of a boy now turned to panic. They had trusted in Goliath, and Goliath had fallen. Without their giant, their courage was dust. On Israel's side, the silence of disbelief gave way to an eruption of joy. Soldiers who had once cowered now found their voices. Spears that had hung limp at their sides were lifted high. "The Philistines flee!" someone cried. And like a fire catching in dry grass, courage spread through the camp. The men of Israel surged forward, chasing the Philistines across the valley, up the hills, and toward the gates of Ekron and Gath. The chase was fierce and swift. The Philistines, once bold in taunts, now cast away their weapons in haste, tripping over one another in desperate retreat. The Israelites pursued with newfound strength, cutting them down along the path to Sharaim, leaving the path littered with the remnants of fear defeated. For every step Goliath had taken to intimidate, Israel now took 10 in triumph. The valley that had been the stage of mockery became a river of victory. Meanwhile, David carried the giant's head as a testimony. He brought it back to Saul's camp, where the soldiers and commanders looked on in awe. None had believed the boy could prevail, yet here he stood, not with spoils of gold, but with the very symbol of their terror held high in his hand. The giant's own sword, which moments before had promised David's death, was now his trophy of deliverance. King Saul himself stared long at the shepherd boy. Astonishment filled his eyes, for he had seen in David what he had lost in himself, unshakable faith. "Whose son art thou, young man?" he asked. And David answered plainly, "I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." The king who had doubted was now left to marvel, for Israel's deliverer was not a general nor a warrior, but a shepherd. The news of victory spread quickly. From camp to village, from hill to city, the story was told, how the God of Israel had delivered his people through the hands of a boy. The shame of cowardice was swallowed up in the joy of triumph. Mothers wept tears of relief, fathers lifted their heads high again, and children whispered David's name with awe. But David himself did not glory in his strength. He knew the truth, that it was not the sling nor the stone, nor even his courage that felled Goliath. It was the Lord, mighty in battle, who had fought for his people. Israel had triumphed not because of who they were, but because of who their God is. The valley of Elah was now a monument to faith, a place where one boy's trust in God restored the courage of a nation.
The battle was won, but the echoes of that victory would resound for generations. Israel had not merely triumphed over the Philistines, they had triumphed over fear itself. And at the heart of it all stood David, the shepherd boy of Bethlehem, whose sling and stone became symbols of faith that moved mountains. The soldiers returned from the chase with spoils of war, their spirits lifted high. Once timid, they now walked with the strength of men who had seen the power of God firsthand. Children in Israel began to sing a new song, their voices rising in every village. Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. This refrain carried both celebration and prophecy, for the people now looked upon David not as a boy, but as a leader chosen by heaven. King Saul, however, wrestled with unease. What he saw in David reminded him of what he once had, a heart bold in the Lord, unafraid of giants. Envy began to stir like a shadow in his soul. While the people praised David, Saul's spirit trembled, for he sensed that this shepherd's rise would one day eclipse his own. Yet for the moment, the nation stood united in triumph. As for David, he did not return to Bethlehem as the shepherd who had left with bread and cheese. He returned with the renown of a warrior and the favor of God written upon his life. But David's greatness was not in the sword or in the fame. It was in his unshakable trust in the Lord of hosts. He knew his sling was nothing, his arm was nothing, his courage was nothing without God. That humility, rooted in faith, became the cornerstone of his legacy. The valley of Elah was remembered not for Goliath's strength, but for God's deliverance. The people told their children, who told their children after them, of the day when a boy faced a giant and proved that faith is greater than fear, and that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Every time fear threatened to rise again, they looked back to David and were reminded, the battle is the Lord's. Generations later, even kings would recall the shepherd boy who slew the giant. His courage would inspire warriors, prophets, and poets alike. His victory would foreshadow an even greater deliverer to come, one who, like David, would stand alone against the enemies of God's people, and through apparent weakness, bring eternal victory. Thus, the story of David and Goliath was never only about a sling and a stone. It was about the power of faith, the downfall of arrogance, and the unshakable truth that when God is for his people, no enemy can stand. David's name was remembered not merely because he killed a giant, but because he trusted in the Lord who cannot fail. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of David and Goliath, a reminder that no obstacle is too great when you are with us. Teach us to trust in you as David did, to face our giants with courage, and to walk in the confidence that the battle belongs to the Lord. Guard us from pride like Goliath's and from fear like Israel's, and fill us with faith that moves mountains. May every reader of this story rise with the assurance that with God, victory is certain. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. If this story blessed you, don't keep it to yourself. The Word of God was never meant to be hidden. By liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing, you help carry His truth further than you could ever imagine. Don't let the blessing stop with you. Pass it on.